Hello, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hello, Assalamu alaikum. We have been talking about PHP, and in previous classes we used PHP functions and we understood how get and post methods work. In today's lecture, we will be discussing sessions in PHP. What sessions are, how we use sessions to manage and track users' activity online, how we use sessions to ensure that the login systems are working and users' login information is saved while he is active on a website. My name is Dr. Shan Bhatti. If you are for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon, and let's begin. Now, today we will be discussing about what is sessions, why and where sessions is used, how session works, and what is session expiry, and how we expire session in other words. Sessions. Generally, session means a limited period of time, or we say a meeting or a period devoted to a particular activity. So typically, a session means that as soon as user logs into a particular website, his limited time period or his activity time period on that website starts, and it is being controlled, monitored, and noted whatever activity he may be performing. So for example, when we log into our Facebook accounts, our session begins. Whenever we log in into our email accounts, as soon as we log in, the session begins. How long that session remains active, that's a different issue. We will talk about the expiry at the end. To get understood about sessions in PHP, we need to go back and review our concepts regarding HTTP, HTML, client, and a server. It was clearly observed that a website is stateless. A general web is a stateless system. There is no continuous connection between a client and a server. HTTP does not remember what happened between two consecutive requests. So when a user sends request 1, it goes to the server, processes it, and then sends the response back. That's it. Then user sends another request. That's a completely different request. Sometimes it has nothing to do, or most of the time it has nothing to do with the first request. So that's where we say it's a stateless. It doesn't continuously maintain every single state. Even two requests are made from same users are different for HTTP. HTTP just processes client's request and supplies the response. That's it. Okay. So what we need to maintain a state. We need to ensure that once a request is sent and response is received, the next request may also be dependent on the first request, or the server may be aware of that what was the first request they sent. Based on that, they might be able to send a proper response or give a proper response or a unique response. To maintain a state means ability to retain the values of a variable, to keep track of users who log onto a system, to distinguish one user from other, to save user preferences, for example, user login system, shopping cart. Whenever we talk about sessions or whenever we talk about maintaining a state or state-oriented system, meaning that once the user accesses a particular domain, all his activities are basically under consideration, under certain monitoring, or his activities are being logged so that it can be tracked that who is performing what activities. Is the activity coming from the same user or some other users, from the same browser or from some other browser? Okay, so this is what we refer to in terms of state. So that's why when we log into our Facebook, we do not need to give passwords again and again for every activity we perform on this server or on that Facebook or on our email or on our Twitter accounts or on our shopping cart applications, because our state is being maintained. Our session, that time period, and our identity from first request to second is being maintained and kept track of. That the first request was sent by user, the same user is sending the second request, the same user is sending the third request. So because of that, a user is not required to log in every time he clicks on a new page. When you click on a new page, again a new request is sent, but then the state is maintained that is the request sent from a new user or some previous user. So this is what basically we mean. So session is one that makes the web stateful, simply maintaining the state. Sessions in PHP specifically, we talk that they are majorly responsible for ensuring that we understand which user is performing what activities throughout one open session. Allows to track information of a user. Session is basically a way of storing variables and making them available across multiple pages of your websites. So once you log in, your session data, a user's session data is maintained, and it is basically being transferred throughout your session time within multiple pages. So every page you click knows which user it is, what is the user data, what was the previous request, and what is the new request. That is how, or that is what session basically allows us to do. A session is unlike other variables in the sense that we are not passing them individually to each new page, but instead retrieving them from the session we open at the beginning of page. Now basically what it means that once you open a session in PHP, the data is sent or saved initially as variables or within variables. Okay, so for example, when you provide your login information, that information is saved and username and detail is saved in a variables, typically known as session itself. Then from one page to another page, we do not send the data of sessions every time like we did in CV Creator in lecture 8. If you have watched PHP lecture 8, you would have found that we maintained the data of user from page 1 to page 2. We send the data within hidden fields from page 1 to page 2. We had to send the data because there was no state being maintained. However, within sessions, we do not need to do that. Once you start a session and start logging the user information there, then you do not need to put or transfer the data between every single page. That session variables automatically becomes a super global. And all the data within the session is, once save it, is already accessible within that session period with multiple pages. So that's where it becomes more interesting and more powerful, that you do not need to transfer data from page to page. It's automatically in your session variable. Session again is like it's in a web application, the session is a sequence of interactions between server and the user. This sequence is again maintained through variables which are transferred automatically between server and user between pages of your particular website. Session refers to the period of activity when a PHP script stores state information on a web server. A session refers to the period of activity. Again, session basically means a certain time slot in which we record user's information, his activities. Within that period, PHP script automatically stores the information in something called super global session variable. Just like post and get and request variables we discussed in lecture 14, you would find that session again is another variable, a super global variable that we use, which maintains the record of our system. All session data is stored on a server, usually in a database to which the client does not have direct access to, linked to that identifier. So basically a session data is saved on your server, accessed through a session variable. The client itself is not aware of that data. So client doesn't know that my session activities is being kept and how it is being kept, where it is being kept. It's just done internally by PHP. A PHP session provides an easy but effective way of passing variables between web pages in a PHP application. The session starts when a PHP site is accessed and ends when the user closes their browser. Typically, whenever we start a session, we log in, our session starts. As soon as we close the browser, our session is automatically destroyed. Or we close the PC, our session is automatically destroyed. However, for example, if you are using Facebook on pages consecutively, you would note that as soon as you start your web page again and you refresh, your Facebook is still active. You do not need to give your username password again. You do not need to initiate the session again. That's because that session information is now saved in something called cookies. So that information is saved in your PC, in your cookie. So next time you log in, that cookie of page is reloaded and the session is reactivated. Okay, that's another thing we will talk about later on, that what happens and how we can make session last with multiple logins. Okay, where session is used and why we need sessions. Previously, we stored information in a hidden form fields. In in lecture 8 in CV Creator, we saved information. If you have watched that, again I will put the link. We have watched that lecture, and within that lecture we saved the information of data from one form to another using hidden fields, and we transferred that from one page to another. From second page to third, again the entire data was transferred using hidden fields. That we did in lecture 8. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. That is one way of maintaining the data from one page to another. To make the data accessible across various pages of the entire website, we use sessions. Because, for example, if there are 2-3 pages, it might be easy that we use hidden fields. But what if there are hundreds of pages and we need to transfer the data consecutively? We need to keep record of which user it is, and that means that we need to transfer the user information across hundreds of pages. So it becomes very difficult to do it manually using hidden fields and post get method. That is why we need sessions to keep track of our users information, to keep track of users activities, to keep track of user itself. Suppose a user is buying book online. There should be a mechanism to keep track of books added to the user's basket. Any online application, if you're aware of, keeps track. As soon as you log in, you view a products, then as whichever product you click on add to cart, add to cart, add to cart, those products are automatically sent to your carts. And then when you finally check out, you see all the list of those items that you selected. How that becomes possible? That becomes possible because of something called session. So as soon as you click add to cart, that particular item is added into your session. Then you keep on browsing and accessing multiple pages, accessing multiple products. Next time you again click on add to cart, it again added to your session. And finally, when you click on checkout, all the items are calculated and presented there. So your record, which user, the items the user selected is and continuously maintained throughout your session window or throughout your time that you spent on that particular browser. This is done using sessions simply. Very common example be the login system, where there is need of state maintenance to check whether user is logged in or not, if the user is valid or not. Okay, so once you log in but you forgot to log out, next time you access the page, was it the same user who accessed previously or is it different user? So sessions are there to keep those tracks for us. How typically a session works? Example, we have a client, our web pages are very accessible. That client sends the data to a web server. When you send the data to a web server, for every session that you start, there is a specific session ID that is created and assigned to each individual user. So it doesn't matter how many users there are. Every user is identified with a unique specific session ID. This session ID keeps tracks and maintains each individual user. So if there is client 1, client 2 or 100 clients, every client will have a unique session ID, and while that session is active, that same ID persists, and from based on that same ID, the session is maintained and noticed by the server. How session works? Session is basically stored, is a file stored on a server. Find which file belongs to which user a cookie is created. Special session cookie is set on the browser, and then we look at that cookie to find the place where a file resides on your server, and then we can look into that file to find information in a session. The typically way of session working is that the session information is saved on a file, basically on client's PC as well as with that session ID on a server, and where it's matched then later on. A cookie is typically a word we use for that file which stores the session information. Nowadays, whenever you visit websites, you get a small message at the bottom as a disclaimer that this websites maintain your sessions by saving cookie information. So it will save your information as a cookie on your PC. This is where sometimes it gets very difficult. If you are using a public PC or a lab PC or PC which is accessible by multiple students on a campus, multiple people on a library or on a public domain, remember when all your activities tend to remain in a cookie in a file on that particular PC. With the right amount of information and knowledge, people can use that cookie to extract your information, like your username, password, for example. Okay, so that is why it is always recommended that whenever you access a public domain, make sure you log in, you do your activities and click on that log out button, and then close the browsers so that the session is destroyed. Sometimes we go and clear the browsing history, and within the network browser settings, there is an option of delete all cookies. So we delete all the cookies as well. That's the one thing, because sessions typically are stored on a file. Remember that file is what we call a cookie. Okay, it's like a text file, it's like a Word file or PowerPoint file. But PowerPoint files are known as presentations, Word files are known as documents, Notepad files are known as text files, whereas a session file that is created automatically is known as a cookie. That cookie holds the secret of the user data, user information. So So it is very essential, very important. That's why nowadays you get those cookie messages every other website, because they let you know that your information is being saved as per a rule. Okay. The information is not there for them to see or edit. They can only change ID, which refers to the file. Like I said, every session has a specific ID. Based on that ID, the cookie is created, and that cookie basically is maintained by using that session ID. So you cannot directly or know about that session or cookie. Yes, you can change the ID of the session, for that example, if you are getting into the back end of working with cookies. They can change ID number. Is a very they can change ID number is a very long and complicated to help ensure we do not end up with hijacking of other session information. Use sessions we use to create a file and set a cookie on user machine. Then we need to find the cookie and corresponding file on the machine. This is done by the session start ID. The session start function starts a new session or continues an existing one. Session start function generates a unique session ID to identify the session. A session ID is a random alphanumeric string that looks something like this. So whenever we start a session or whenever we intend to start a session and create a cookie on a user's machine, basically we need to call a function within PHP called session start. This is a function that is used to initiate and begin each user's session. The session wouldn't start until you click or use this function. Okay, we will see a few examples later on. Whenever we click on start or whenever we call this start session function, for example, when user clicks login, if data is sent to the server validates the user data and IDs are same, then server starts the session for that user. Once the session starts, now user activity is being controlled and managed by server and saved on a cookies. Each session then is assigned a unique alphanumeric ID. The session start functions create a text file on a web server that is same name as the session ID preceded by SESS_. So you can actually view your cookies on a server as well, on your local browser as well. That's why I said we need to be careful whenever we use public PCs, because your information is safe. We will be talking about how you can access manually these session IDs and session files on your server, for example on XAMPP, and we see information that is stored on there. We'll talk about that later. So how session basically works: in order to initiate a session, basically we need to use the session start function. So a PHP tag is written session_start bracket close semicolon. This is the built-in function that is used to start the session. The command should be called only once in each page. It must be called before the PHP scripts generate any output. So the ideal position is immediately after opening the PHP tag. Do remember that. This session should always be always should be written once every page. You have to write it in every page, first thing. Then you have to write only once on every page. Okay, and typically it's always written before any output is generated using PHP. So before you print the statements or print the output or print the user data, you should have started the session already. So it's always recommended that as soon as you start a PHP tag, write the sessions right after immediately. If any output is generated before the call to session start, the command fails and the session won't be activated for that particular page. So it's a mandatory aspect of sessions that it should be the first statement before you printing the entire outputs. So you write it as a first statement. When a session is initiated, the server stores information in a session variables that can be accessed by other pages as long as the session remains active, normally until the browser is closed. So once the session is initiated, a cookie is created, and at the front end, a cookie is created at the back end on the PC to store the data. At the front end, a variable, a super global session variables is created, which stores the information of a session. Okay, because the identifier is unique to each visitor, the information stored in a session variables cannot be seen by anyone else. So once you start a session on one page, is unique to that particular browser and page and that user. So if you have another browser opened and you access the same website, that will have a different session. If there is another user on a different PC, they start the same session, again that's a different case. It will not have the same ID, so it will be completely unique as well. So server will identify each as a different user. Storing and retrieving session data. PHP provides the session variable, super global variable. Like we discussed, that variable or the session data is stored in a variables. In front end, we access or use the session data using this variables. This variable is $_session and the variable name to store and retrieve data as we do in the normal practice. So if in previous class we discussed post and get methods and request methods. So if you understood those methods, this method is also similar to them. Okay, so when we use post variables $_post and we use a variable name or a what we call the value name from the text fields that came. Same thing in sessions as well. In this case, we create our own variables and we store the value in that, and then that variable is saved to sessions. We use this variable to store and retrieve the data. For example, we create a PHP, we start the session. So session is always started first. Once the session is started, then the session variable is accessible. Once the session variable is once the session variable is started, session is started, then the session variable is accessible. Within the session variable, the format is that we give a particular variable name. Any name can be given, is equals to this is the data to be stored. This is a typical way of saving the data in a session. Again, session is started, now session variable cookie is created. But what information is to be stored on a session is again the responsibility of the programmer. It's the responsibility of programmer to know and require which information of the user is to be saved on a variable or not. For example, sometimes we don't, or most of the times we don't save up passwords on a session variables to ensure obviously security. Like your credit card number or your credit card PIN number, we try not to save it in sessions directly because this data can be accessible. So it's our responsibility. User has no concern with it. The client at the front end has no concern with it. Session started, session variable is created automatically. We store this $_session variable name and its value. This is what we do. So whenever we want to know which user it is, for example, this can be my username and the username comes here. So variable name can be username and the user actual name comes here. So this is where I would ensure in my next page that is the username same as it was previously or not. So we can write a condition to simply evaluate that the session that is continuing, is it for the same user or not? If it is, if the same username exists in the session, that means my session is for the same user. If it is not, then I will destroy the session and recreate it so that I know it's a new user. I can print the data of a session on my web page as well. Okay, so sessions are used to transfer the data, which can then again be printed on a system or on a web page as well by simply using the echo statement $session variable name. Using session data variables. Having established a session, you can now create, store and retrieve information pertaining to that particular session. Information to be stored for a session is kept in a session variable. This is where you both store and retrieve the session data. These variables are all stored in a single array, so $_session variable. Now just like $_post, $_get or $_request variables, session is again a variable that stores data in form of array. This array is known as an associative array because the names or the array indexes are based on the key or where names or a string and the value is mapped to it. So whatever data we save in this session variables is stored in an associative array form. For example, we create PHP session start, as we discussed, first statement has to be first statement. The session is initiated. Once the session is stated, only then we would be able to use the $_session variables. So once we start the session, then only we would be able to use the $_session variables. $_session variable is basically a super global variable that saves the data in an associative array form. Like associative array rules, we have array name or a key is equals to the value. So for example, we want to store the value of a color. Color becomes the key and red becomes the value. So $_session size is equals to small. So size is basically the key and the small becomes the value. $_shape, again shape becomes the key and the round becomes the value. In order to use it, now we will use these keys to access the data that has been stored in a session. This data would now internally be written in a cookie and it would be available throughout the particular web page or website that we want to work with, as long as the session is being maintained, as long as you write session start on every single page, retrieving the session data. In order to retrieve the session data, the PHP session variables can be used in exactly the same way as other PHP global variables, like $_post, like $_get, like, for example, any other variable for that site. To retrieve a session variable, you simply need to echo that variable. For example, if you need to access that variable on any other page, you need to start a session first, just like this, $PHP session start. So like we said, once within a website, we have to ensure that the session variable is started. Then we use the echo $_session color, $_session size, $_session paper, the variables or the keys that we specified in previous example. Now these data or whatever data is inside the sessions would be printed, or whatever the data is mapped to a particular key will be printed on the echo statement. This is how we basically use the session variables. So externally, it is basically same as $.post, $.get, or $.request, and similarly $.session. Internally, it is saved in a cookie file. You do not need to transfer the data manually from one page to another. Once you create a session, this data is automatically stored. Session expiry. Now, it is also very essential to understand the session expiry, because the session can last for a long time, or it can be closed or expire within a very short time. Most banks do that. So if there is no activity on your web page, for example, for 3 minutes, the session automatically expires to ensure your security. So if you accidentally leave your page open, the session would automatically expire. You would find this happening on many websites, that if you leave your website open, after some minutes, after some time, like 10-15 minutes, you revisit the website, it will ask you to re-log in, because the session has expired. Because of the security reasons, it understood that the time has elapsed. Now the session has automatically been closed. By default, the PHP session expires after a certain length of inactivity. The default is 24 minutes. You can change that. The default is 24 minutes. So after every 24 minutes, your page or the session of that page will automatically be destroyed. The PHP garbage collection process deletes the session variable. Now, garbage collection is basically a process where all unnecessary data or variable data is basically deleted from the system automatically, to ensure the data is not saved permanently. And then again, to ensure that data is not occupying the memory, and the memory is released and the system works further on. That's why the garbage collection is again a key principle in many languages. If you have done Java, you might have used garbage collection there as well. See, in PHP, this garbage collection for a session is automatically done after every 24 minutes. However, you can change that as well by going into your PHP ini file. To check the session expiry time stored in a PHP ini file, we use ini_get brackets session.garbage collection for gc_maximum lifetime. This is a function with a particular argument will return the time of your session, that when the session will expire. ini_get. The argument we pass to it is session.gc_max lifetime. Unset variable. Unset destroys the specified variable. For example, you have stored some data in a session. Remember, in sessions we store user information. However, we do not want to store some information permanently, but some information we do want to keep until the user is active, like your password, like your credit card number. We just want to ensure that credit card number is entered, processed, and then there it is deleted. But the rest of the data may be there. So unset is a method we use to ensure that certain variable values are destroyed from within a session, rather than destroying the complete session itself. It returns a no value. It is used if a session is used, use unset to unregister a session variable. Unset $_session variable name or the key name. What this will do, it will only delete that particular variable or that particular key and its data, letting the rest of the data be still available for usage throughout the website. So some data we use within the sessions, but we do not want to keep it for a longer period of time. We use this method unset, and it is very essential to remember that. So some information like your passwords, like your user area or user information that is very sensitive, for example, phone numbers or contact details or any personal information that we do not want to remain for the rest of the period. Once you log in and register, we delete only those specific information. Be very specific, be very cautious about something. Do not unset the whole $_session variable. For example, with its unset $_session, if you use only $_session, as this will disable the registration of session variables through the session super global variables. So basically, your entire session variables will be disabled and deleted, and you will not be able to use it anymore, which is not recommended. Sometimes we do it in a very secure environment to ensure that all variables are unset and deleted manually. But again, it's not commonly used to delete entire session variables. Session destroy. This is what we do if we need to destroy the session manually. Unlike unset, unset deletes only specific values. Like we said, we do not use unset to destroy the whole session. But if you need to manually destroy the entire session, for example, when we click logout, this is where we need to destroy the session. So now the user session information is supposed to be deleted from the system. So no, the cookie or the information that is stored in cookies needs to be removed and deleted for safe security reasons. We use something called session destroy. Destroys all data registered to a session. Session destroy destroys all of the data associated with current session of that particular user. It will not destroy any other sessions. So if you have two browsers both accessing the website with different IDs, it will only destroy the session from where you have accessed it. The other will still be active, or some other user sessions, they will still be active. Remember, each session is being tracked with specific session ID. So only a specific session ID will be destroyed. This is we use when we want to log out specifically, or after a timeout we want to ensure the session has been destroyed. So we destroy a specific session where all user information needs to be removed from that particular system. It does not unset any of the global variables associated with the session or unset the session cookie. Returns true on success or false on failure. Session ID. This is another method that we use to get a current session ID or sometimes set a current session ID. ID, if ID is specified, it will replace the current session ID. So if in an argument, if you specify current ID, it will set that as your session ID. Session ID needs to be called before session start for that purpose. Depending on the session handler, not all characters are allowed with the session ID. For example, the file session handler only allows characters in the range of A to Z and numerics, comma and minus signs. Session ID returns the session ID for the current session, or an empty string if there is no current session or no current session ID exists. So use this method if you want to set your own specific session IDs, which sometimes we don't use commonly. We let the system handle the session IDs itself, but in certain situations we might require that we create our own custom session IDs, which we might use for future reference. In that case, we set our own IDs. For example, set the session ID to Zishan Academy. Instead of creating any alphanumeric random number, I want a session to be specific. So I use session underscore ID first before even starting a session. Use session underscore ID is equal and within brackets as an ID we give a comment, Zishan Academy, for example. Now we start session ID. So now once the session ID started, a method has already been said that instead of using your own alphanumeric generated session ID like we discussed previously, use this text as your session ID. Now if I echo this session same method, echo my session ID is use the same method without the arguments, it will return the session ID. So if you give it an argument, that argument will be used to set the session. The same method is used to get the session ID if there is no argument specified. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. Save session path. Get and set current session path. Session save path returns the path of the current directory used to save the session data. Most of the equations, again, we do not tamper with it and let the system handle the path automatically. But in certain situations, we can set a custom path where we want to save the session data. The parameter required is the path and the session data path. If it's specified, the path to which the data is saved will be basically changed. Maybe you want to save your session cookies at a specific path on your system. So you can find it easily and use it to process some data. You can do that as well. However, again, not highly recommended, but still people tend to use it to certain purpose. Save session path needs to be called before the session start again, because once the session starts, it does everything automatically. So it's like few things like session ID and session path are something that needs to be told to session before the session is actually started. So if you set a session ID and session path before the session ID starts, now when the session starts, it will consider your name, it will consider your path, and then based on those two parameters, it will initiate the session. Okay. So it returns the path of the current directory used for the data storage. For example, if I create a PHP variable, save session save underscore path, and we use paths such as C drive users. Now this path will be used to save my session information, session data, and the cookies that we talked about. So we will have a text file which will be a cookie named with, if you have named it ID yourself with that particular name, or in this case it will give up any random session ID based on the protocol that is set by session itself. Then the session starts and then we can print that path as well. Then you can go into this path and check the data that you have stored in that particular session ID. Hope this was clear enough. Now in next class we will be working on few more examples of sessions, how we create and use sessions in PHP practically with various different examples like login, registration, and tracking user and data. This is Dr. Ishan Birdi. Thank you very much for watching.